On this Monday night, Canadian doctors send out an SOS. Hospitals crowded with sick children.
We need to protect each other.
The pleas for mask mandates and Ottawa's remedy for a medicine shortage. A man in Quebec accused of spying for Beijing.
This is the first time this charge has been laid in Canada.
As the Chinese and American presidents hold a rare face-to-face. Gratitude and grief in Ukraine.
This war to the best heroes of our country.
Cautious optimism after a key city's liberation. And navigating life at sea.
It's a bit of a Groundhog Day.
The small comforts on this big Navy ship.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with what so many parents of young children already know. Kids are getting sick with alarming frequency, and many emergency rooms in this country are overwhelmed. The surge in respiratory viruses, flu, RSV, and COVID is sweeping across Canada. Today, Ontario's top doctors strongly recommended masks be worn in all indoor public settings. Quebec is recommending mask wearing too, but no jurisdiction has returned to mask mandates. That's what some doctors are demanding. Health Canada did announce today it's importing children's pain and fever medication to alleviate the shortage in pharmacies and is asking parents not to hoard it. Mike Drolet has our top story tonight.
It's a rite of fall for pediatric ICUs to be pushed to their limits. But with the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario at over 200% capacity and Toronto's overwhelmed Sick Kids Hospital cancelling surgeries, the medical community is putting up the white flag.
We need to protect our health system. We need to protect each other. And it's really getting back to all of those basics. We need a reboot.
Dr. Kieran Moore wants a return to masking as a recommendation, not mandatory, because the threat has changed.
This isn't COVID that's affecting our children.
Rather, it's the flu and RSV, a respiratory infection that usually presents itself as a moderate cold for which there is no vaccine. Even though doctors insist masks will help, 2 years of pandemic sacrifices make it a tough sell.
We all know that masks don't work.
We do?
Of course. I think it's a gimmick. It's in order to put people to sleep again.
There's no gimmick as far as Lauren Dempsey knows. Her son George was admitted to Sick Kids 4.5 weeks ago with RSV, and he's had to be intubated twice.
It is insane.
He's clear of RSV now, but before he goes home, his mother is fighting to get him a treatment he's previously had as a high-risk child that would reduce his chance of returning to a hospital where the cafeteria is being used for overflow patients.
You don't want to leave your room because you're afraid you're going to, catch something. And they're doing the best they can.
So how'd this happen? Doctors point to staffing issues that have plagued the system for years, and empty medicine shelves in pharmacies have given parents few options but to go to the ER, a problem the federal government says will get better in the coming weeks.
Just a few hours ago, we announced an important importation of a few months additional supply of analgesics for children, which will make a big difference in the ability of children to be cared in Canada.
Care is one thing, say top doctors, but they'd like to see people put more effort into preventing the spread in the first place.
The impact is really meaningful for some family and now many families. And I think if we remember, the human face of this, it's crushing.
Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
Espionage charges have been laid against a former employee at Hydro-Quebec. 35-year-old Yusheng Wang faces 4 charges. It's alleged he stole trade secrets from the provincial energy provider to benefit the People's Republic of China while he was working as a researcher for Hydro-Quebec. Mike Armstrong reports on the investigation, what else the RCMP allege, and what happens next.
The RCMP isn't saying much about its investigation, only that it started in August with a tip from Hydro-Quebec and wrapped up Monday morning with an arrest at the suspect's home. 35-year-old Yusheng Wang will appear in court Tuesday.
Mr. Wang was charged with espionage for obtaining trade secrets in the course of his duties with Hydro-Quebec.
According to Hydro-Quebec, Wang was a researcher at this facility just outside Montreal, the center of excellence in transportation electrification and energy storage. Hydro says its security teams did an initial investigation, realized the scope of the problem, and called police. Wang was cut off from the company's research and fired. According to his online profiles, Wang had worked for Hydro since October of 2016. Prior to that, he'd worked at the University of Arkansas and the Queen Mary University of London. He was educated in China. Now, what he's alleged to have done in Canada is passed on research from Hydro-Quebec to a Chinese university and other Chinese research centers.
He reportedly published scientific articles and submitted patents in association with this foreign actor rather than with Hydro-Quebec.
I think there is a blessing in disguise.
Michel Juno Katsuya is a former senior intelligence officer with Canada's spy agency, CSIS. He says the arrest is a good sign people are being vigilant and also a warning to others who aren't. Economic espionage costs Canada, he says, between $100 and $120 billion a year.
Stealing intellectual property is not only done by the Chinese, many countries and even friends are doing it.
Now, Hydro-Quebec is considered by the RCMP an at-risk sector, meaning its work and research is of strategic interest and to be protected. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
And China's President Xi Jinping met with the American president for 3 hours today ahead of the G20 summit. It's their first in-person meeting since becoming leaders of their respective countries. They agreed to work to repair the relationship. Biden says the U.S. is not looking for conflict, but he wants China to, as he says, comply with the international rules of the road. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is also at the G20, where the war in Ukraine is top of the agenda. At issue, whether Western countries can convince Russian allies to take a stronger stance against Vladimir Putin. But there's a risk that divisions over the war could end up splitting up the group. As Mackenzie Gray reports from Bali, Canada is pushing to further isolate Russia.
Russia's brutal war in Ukraine is creating food and energy crises. It's disrupting supply chains and raising the cost of living.
Even before the G20 starts, the Prime Minister is attempting to push the agenda towards focusing on Vladimir Putin. And his government is backing up the tough talk by announcing a $500 million military aid package to support the Ukrainians. But that new money was short on details.
Our goal is to make sure that the troops in Ukraine on the ground have access to additional military support soon.
This is the last thing the host of the G20 wanted announced, with Indonesia attempting to get Western countries to soften their language on Ukraine in a bid to try and find consensus around the G20 table with Russian allies.
I'm sure they also think that there's really no realistic prospect of the G20 coming to an agreement on the situation in Ukraine. Russia and China, of course, and India as well, would probably rather not have any particular statement in the final communique on that.
One of those allies, China, whose President Xi Jinping met with U.S. President Joe Biden in person for the first time since Biden took office. The high-stakes meeting lasted 3 hours, with China promising to promptly follow up and implement the important common understandings reached.
We're going to compete vigorously, but I'm not looking for conflict. I'm looking to manage this competition responsibly. And I want to make sure that every country abides by the international rules of the road.
The leaders of France and Australia are also getting a one-on-one with Xi Jinping. As for Canada, the Foreign Affairs Minister wouldn't say if they even asked for a meeting.
Our goal is always to make sure that we have a dialogue, even on difficult issues.
Canada also sanctioned 23 Russians involved in the arrest of a prominent Russian opposition leader. And late Monday night, Russia pushed back. They sanctioned 100 Canadians, including author Margaret Atwood, actor Jim Carrey, and our own chief political correspondent, David Aiken. Donna?
All right, Mackenzie Gray in Bali, Indonesia tonight. Thanks. A moving moment today. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy singing the national anthem during a surprise visit to the newly liberated city of Kherson. Zelenskyy called the moment heartwarming and said despite the destruction and the number of dead, Ukrainians have proved it is impossible to kill Ukraine. Russian troops retreated from the city last Friday, a move seen as a major setback for Russia in its almost 9-month war on Ukraine. Redmond Shannon reports on what it could signal.
Another moment of joy in Kherson, a newly liberated city that has had little to smile about for more than 8 months.
President Zelenskyy, is this the beginning of the end of the war?
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy hopeful but realistic in his answer.
This long wait difficult way, because this war took the best heroes of our country. We're ready for peace, but our peace for our country is all our country, all our territory.
In his short visit, he thanked soldiers and the remaining residents of the regional capital left without power or running water and still under Russian shelling, according to Ukraine. Zelenskyy says NATO supplies deserve some of the credit too.
All this victory is possible when all the world is around Ukraine.
He says there is evidence of more than 400 war crimes in nearby areas abandoned by Russia. As residents enjoy the end of occupation, they accuse Russian soldiers of looting a city the Kremlin supposedly regarded as its own.
They have stolen everything. They have stolen our trolley buses, our ambulances.
At the G20, Vladimir Putin was a no-show, sending Sergei Lavrov instead. A report that the foreign minister was admitted to hospital in Bali, quickly dismissed by him on social media. As ever, blaming the West for sowing fake news. Meanwhile, in Turkey, Russia's spy chief, Sergei Narishkin, met with the head of the CIA, William Burns, the highest profile in-person talks between Moscow and Washington since the war began. They reportedly discussed managing the risk of a nuclear conflict. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Countering threats from within. Coming up, criticism the Canadian military isn't doing enough to fight white supremacy. A new report released today by the National Security and Intelligence Agency found white supremacy poses an active threat to and within the Canadian military. The review also concluded the Canadian Forces National Counterintelligence Unit's ability to monitor the threat is limited. Eric Sorensen looked into the findings and the recommendations. Eric.
Donna, the review focused on the Canadian Forces National Counterintelligence Unit and its domestic efforts to identify insider threats. It found there has been inadequate integration with other security teams in the Defense Department and that the unit has not been up to the task of countering extremism in spite of multiple reviews. The counterintelligence unit has been the subject of 10 internal studies in the last quarter century. All found the unit suffered from resource and policy limitations, resulting in an inability to fully meet its mandate. This review does not significantly depart from these previous assessments. Former Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan undertook a review that found the military has not done enough to identify and prevent extremism. White supremacy scandalized the Canadian military almost 30 years ago when the Canadian Airborne Regiment was disbanded after some members beat a Somali teenager to death. More recently, a former engineer in the Canadian Army Reserve, Patrick Matthews, was sentenced to 9 years in prison in the U.S. for his role in a plot to attack a pro-gun rally in Virginia, allegedly to instigate a race war. The National Security and Intelligence Review Agency says in its report that white supremacist groups seek out individuals with prior military training and encourages others to enlist in the military to gain access to military tactics and equipment. While the agency found that white supremacy poses an active counterintelligence threat, this government, like previous governments, has not said how it will fix the problem. On top of that, the revelations could further discourage recruitment at a time when demands on the Canadian Armed Forces are only increasing. Donna?
All right, Eric Sorensen in Ottawa, thank you. We are getting our first look at the discussions that took place in Cabinet before the Federal Emergencies Act was invoked in February. The commission reviewing use of the act is hearing from senior bureaucrats who advised federal politicians, among them the Deputy Minister at the Department of Public Safety, Rob Stewart. He testified today he was concerned invoking the act might cause more harm than good and possibly incite bigger, more violent demonstrations. That didn't happen. Instead, Stewart says the threat of removing trucks, driver's licenses, and insurance was more effective than expected.
Others have come forward to say that this was a tool that they, in the end, used and found useful.
Tomorrow is another big day. RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki will take the stand at the inquiry. Canada wants to make history on the moon. Plans were announced this morning to build the country's first lunar rover. The design and building of the space vehicle is being led by Canadensis Aerospace. The federal government says the goal is to find water ice in the lunar soil, a critical resource if humans are to colonize the moon. The rover could be sent to space as early as 2026. Republican ruminations ahead, the tough decisions facing the GOP following disappointment in the midterms. The dust still hasn't settled from last week's midterm elections in the U.S. We know Democrats will keep control of the Senate, but the House remains up for grabs. Several races are too close to call. Ballots are still being counted. And looming over that, the prospect of former President Donald Trump making another run for the White House. Jackson Prosco reports.
In Bali, a long-distance victory lap by President Joe Biden.
The American people prove once again that democracy is who we are.
Democrats' big wins came after most of Donald Trump's hand-picked candidates went down in defeat, taking with them Trump's lies about the 2020 election.
There was a strong rejection of election deniers at every level, from those seeking to lead our states and those seeking to serve in Congress.
The searing rebuke has weakened the former president's standing, raising questions about a Trump comeback in 2024 on the eve of his planned campaign announcement.
The president tweets Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done.
Speaking to ABC News, former Vice President Mike Pence seized the moment, openly criticizing his former boss for the events of January 6th.
It angered me. I mean, the president's words were reckless. It was clear he decided to be part of the problem.
Behind the scenes, some Republicans are reportedly pushing Trump to delay his campaign launch.
What we got to do, we got to get out and vote.
Especially with the Senate race in Georgia between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock headed to a December runoff.
Maybe his announcement and his prominence in the campaign, maybe that's another bad sign for Republicans in a runoff situation.
Welcome to Congress.
Newly elected members of Congress have already started orientation at the Capitol.
Very excited.
Yeah.
Taking a piece of history right now.
But nothing can prepare rookie Republicans for the turmoil that awaits. The party is not just split over Trump, but also what to do about leaders like Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, who oversaw the party's disappointing election performance. Their fates, along with control of the House, are still undecided. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
Funerals are being held in Istanbul, Turkey, for the victims of a bombing on a busy shopping street Sunday. 6 people were killed, 2 members from 3 families, including a 3-year-old girl who was shopping with her father. Mourners have placed flowers at the site of the bombing. No one has claimed responsibility. The Turkish government has blamed the PKK, a Kurdish terrorist organization. It denies any involvement. Dozens of people have been arrested, including a woman who police say was sitting on a bench in the area and left minutes before the explosion. Sailing the Arctic Sea next, a look at life on board one of Canada's largest Navy ships. Members of the Royal Canadian Navy are used to spending months at sea, but sailing the Arctic Ocean is unlike anything most have experienced before. They are far from home, almost entirely cut off from the outside world as they patrol the far north of the country. Well, earlier this fall, Jeff Semple joined the crew on board the newly commissioned HMCS Margaret Brooke, and he gives us a rare look at life at sea.
Sailors on HMCS Margaret Brooke are responding to an emergency announcement. A fire in the engine room on board the Arctic icebreaker.
Last cycle, okay?
This is a drill, one of several held without warning every week on the Navy vessel to keep these sailors on their toes. The crew spends months at sea, patrolling the Canadian Arctic.
It's definitely a different and unique way of life.
Even for seasoned sailors, the Arctic feels cut off from the outside world. Limited internet or phone means little contact with loved ones back home.
It's always difficult leaving home for an extended period of time.
The ship's executive officer has a 20-month-old son.
In this picture, probably was taken in April or so.
He spent the past 2 months away at sea.
I'm a new dad, so it adds kind of a new perspective to it, a new side to things going away.
Now, the Margaret Brooke is part of a new class of Arctic Patrol ships, some of the biggest ships to be built by the Canadian Navy in 50 years. It's 100 meters long, there are 8 decks here, but it can still feel at times like a little bit of a tight squeeze. So for that reason, there are plenty of spots on board where sailors can stretch their sea legs. From the lounge to the gym. There's also a doctor's office treating a range of ailments, including the most common, which we experienced firsthand, seasickness.
There are some people that are just chronic seasick.
Here we go. Floodgates will open.
Stephen Clark is in charge of morale. He says one of the most important rooms is the cafeteria.
Definitely on the ship, morale runs through the galley.
Offering a different menu every day of the week.
Especially on this type of operation, there's a bit of a Groundhog Day right now.
We got nachos for the table.
Just anything to do something a little different to break up the monotony in the daily routine.
Number 3, type of pasta that takes its name from Italian little worms.
That includes trivia night, crib tournaments, and the fan favorite, Sundays on Sundays, served by the ship's senior officers. A tasty tradition, except when the commander accidentally mixes up the caramel with the barbecue sauce. For the ship's 65 sailors, far from home, the crew feels like a second family, living and working together to navigate one of the most remote regions on Earth. Jeff Semple, Global News, on board HMCS Margaret Brooke.
Sundays on Sunday. I like that idea. That is Global National for this Monday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is the snowy rural municipality of Hanover, southeast of Winnipeg. We'd love to see your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.